Hello, everyone. Welcome. Seeing folks starting to trickle in. Really glad folks will be able to join us today on this Friday afternoon. I'm currently in Washington, D.C., and it is a lovely fall day that's peeking outside. So really appreciate you all taking the time to join us today. We have, I think, a pretty jam-packed hour to get through this topic, of which I think everyone should know at this point, but we're here to talk about the new FCC broadband maps. We're going to talk about the actual fabric layer itself. We're going to try to get really into the weeds while also keeping it high level and accessible for everybody. There are plenty of very technical resources out there that will go into the exact data specifications that are required. We are not the FCC, though. We are going to be talking about some of the things we've seen from our perspectives and really try to emphasize for folks why this map is critically important to get right and why there's a level of urgency right now within these next few weeks to submit community-driven data in terms of the location and then preparing for when the availability will be layered on top of this new FCC map. So we have an hour to get through. If we can jump to the next slide, I'll actually introduce myself. Hello, I am Jake Varn from the Pew Charitable Trust. I think we have a next slide. We'll have a set of headshots for all of our speakers that were joining us today, joined by Dustin Loop, CORI and Zacher, and Anderson Clayton. So I'm from the Pew Charitable Trust. Pew is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research institution focused on solving big challenges with evidence-based data. And I'm on the Broadband Access Initiative, where we specifically focus on state broadband policy. And I think we'll just do a very quick round the horn for folks to introduce themselves, and then I'll lay out a little bit of an agenda for the next hour. So Dustin, do you want to go next? Give us a quick hello.
Hey, everyone. I am Dustin Loop, program manager with the National Broadband Mapping Coalition, and I've spent more time looking at FCC documents than anyone really should. So looking forward to sharing some of that information with you.
Thanks, Dustin. Corianne?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm CORI Zacher, Senior Policy Counsel at Next Century Cities. So I work with all of our members across the country and help connect them with state leaders and also with each other and provide them with resources. So really excited to be here to talk about mapping today. And Anderson?
Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much. As everyone said, we're amazed at the turnout for this, which just means that a lot of people have really good questions. But my name is Anderson Clayton. I'm a broadband analyst for Rural Innovation Strategies. We focus on helping rural communities access and expand broadband in their communities. So I'm really excited to be here. And thank you to all of my rural county officials that joined us today. I'm really excited to hopefully help you all answer some of these questions that you have. Back to you, Jake.
Yeah, and shout out to Rizzy and the CORI team for hosting this webinar on their Zoom account. Okay, so we can jump to the next slide and I'll walk through a little bit of what we have planned for us. First, I'll give a little bit of background of why we're all here together and this logo that you see on the screen, the National Broadband Resource Hub, and then we'll get into the meat and potatoes of this conversation, walking through the timeline for this FCC map, why this map is different from other ones, as well as the actual process of navigating the portal from what we've seen from our perspective. Again, we are not the FCC, but we've been talking with many of you around the country that have been engaged in this process for many months now. And lastly, we will have plenty of time, I hope, for questions. You should see a Q&A box on your screens on Zoom. So feel free to pepper us with questions as they come to you. We also have a bevy of questions to get in that people submitted ahead of time. So thank you for that. We will try our best to answer as many of those throughout and then also share some additional resources afterwards, because I think we have quite literally 8 pages of questions that came in today. Okay, so next slide, and just right off the top. So the three of us as organizations, and that is Next Century Cities, Rizzy, and Pew, are here today as partners in the National Broadband Resource Hub, which is a platform that we all work on together. It has really three main components that we see as really vital for the broadband community. One is a compendium of resources that is really customized and hand-selected for the reports and fact sheets and issue briefs on a variety of topics in a curated platform that people can peruse, including many of our reports, but also reports from other researchers and other organizations. I'm going to go out of order. Three is a help desk. We have a help desk feature on this platform. It's a simple Q&A box that you can send questions to. That goes to those of us on this call, our organizations directly. And number two, a community conversations portal. So there's a forum on the National Broadband Resource Hub where folks can ask questions and share resources with one another, comment and share updates. So we'll drop a link to that somewhere. It's the broadbandhub.org. And we'll have more on that to come and sending out more resources there. But back to the matter of hands, mapping. Anderson, I will go ahead and pass it over to you. Talk a little bit about why this issue matters.
Yes, thank you so much, Jake, for setting the stage and talking a little bit about the hub that I hopefully see all of you get on after this call, because we're really excited about the things that are going on there. Why mapping matters, I think that we can set the stage here by basically talking about one acronym that we've heard a lot, BEAD. The Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, BEAD, was established by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA, which is another fun acronym that I feel like we have all heard a ton of times over bit. But it appropriated $42 billion, right, for states and territories and local governments, right, to be able to utilize for broadband deployment and mapping adoption projects at the end of this. And so what I really want to set the stage with is that there are three main components of why mapping matters. And the first one is going to be funding. There are two different times in this process where the funding that you are going to be receiving at the community level is going to be impacted by how good your maps are from the state level all the way up, right? And so we really want to make sure that communities understand that having access to this portal, being able to make sure that your community is saying, hey, I want to make sure my people are counted. I want to make sure that I understand where there is and isn't service, is going to directly relate back to the funding that your community is also going to receive from the infrastructure bill at the end of the day. And the other part about this is accountability. We all know, especially my rural folks out there, that we want to be able to hold providers' feet to the fire to some degree with these new maps. We want to make sure that service and availability is accurate, and we want to make sure that we know in our communities where underserved and unserved people are. These maps are going to hopefully keep providers honest and about where there is and isn't service, and also where they plan to expand out in your communities. And if a provider is able to win an award in your community, also hopefully be able to push them to reach the areas that you know are going to be underserved based on these new maps. And also community goals. I know that all of us in rural areas right now are talking about what does the future of our economic development really look like. And I think that broadband is a huge part of that, and being able to articulate and being able to share where there is and isn't access is going to be extremely important for economic development in the future. New businesses coming into your communities and having access to it. We need a globalized economy in our communities. We know that, and we want to make sure that we have access to it, which means broadband everywhere now. Next slide, if you don't mind, Dustin. Hopefully, all of that is going to lead into the difference that can actually show. And I have a map right here that I really want to give a good spotlight to, because it shows the state of Georgia has done some really incredible work over the last 3 years with actually proactively going in and trying to find where there is and isn't service for coverage data in their community. And what the difference is between the state of Georgia's map that they have now, Broadband Now, which uses national speed test data from Ookla and other data sources to be able to determine availability, and then also the old FCC maps, which are based on old Form 477 forms that were submitted by providers themselves. And so when you look at these three categories, why mapping matters and why that we need local participants in this especially is because going all the way up to the state level, we want to make sure our folks get counted in rural communities. And that is going to be the difference, is hopefully having a map that looks like to the right of our screen versus a map that looks like to the left of our screen, where people are obviously getting left out of that process every time. So I'm going to pass it over to CORI, who's going to tell you all a little bit more about the timeline for this and the process that's going to happen.
Sure. Thank you so much, Anderson. And just to reiterate a couple of things that Jake and Anderson mentioned, the big difference between this current mapping process and some of the stuff that's been happening in the past at the FCC is that this map is a lot more granular. So it was Congress told the FCC that they needed to improve their maps in 2020. So this has been a really long time coming, but it is also built into the IIJA's the funding NOFO that NTIA put out. So the notice of funding opportunity, if you haven't looked at it, the high level mapping points are that they will be using this map that the FCC is putting together to allocate the funding that's coming through the BEAD program. So each state is going to get 100 million up for, or a minimum of 100 million. And then on top of that, they'll get funding based on how many unserved locations they have. So that's places that don't have access to 25.3, which is still the federal broadband standard. And so these maps are really important to making sure that each state gets funding for all of the locations that are unserved. And so the big highlight that's happening right now is that the FCC has put together this list of locations. So these are just the underlying locations, no availability data on top of them. But the local governments have a really important role in improving that, because a lot of local data wasn't necessarily used in putting that list together. So local governments that have 911 data, utility data, you might have information that the FCC wasn't able to access when putting this map together. So making sure that the information that you have lines up with what the FCC has is really important, and trying to get that in as soon as possible, because next month in November, the FCC anticipates releasing the availability data that's going to go on top of those locations. And if all of those locations aren't listed and there's a location that's not on the map that is unserved, the state isn't going to get as much funding for that location. So it really matters to get it right now, so that all of the funding that comes out sometime next year, hopefully, will really reflect the number of locations that need access to broadband. And so that sort of leads into what's happening in late 2022. So once the availability data is released, we'll start to see challenges to that data. So everyone on this call, I know that we're all very concerned with making sure that the availability data is accurate as well. So all of the locations that are on the map are going to have some determination of whether or not they have service and what kind of service is available. And the FCC is really focused on availability and not on some of the performance metrics that I know all of us on this call are very concerned with, but that will be less of a part of the FCC's process. But where it will come in is in some of the state processes. So a lot of states already have broadband maps. They may already have challenge processes set up, but making sure that you can provide some of that performance data to your state can impact whether or not there's funding for specific projects, and also help with the states as they're doing some of their planning and community engagement. Really making sure that local voices are reflected in that process is super important. So I think that's all from me. Hi, Jake. I see the
I just want to make sure we hit this on the head before we dive a little bit deeper into the weeds. This is a fantastic slide the CORIans put together for everyone. But just to really underscore this, right now, the FCC map that is going to be released next month is based off of a layer of location data that was given to providers back over the summer. Folks have not had a chance until recently, until last month or so, to see this data and begin to point out where it may be missing communities, where it may be missing individual households. The availability that providers reported on over the summer is what's going to be coming out in November. And then there will be future iterations of this map, as this is going to be a continually evolving process that will hopefully be getting better and better. But as Corian is laying out here, there is a specific point in time where NTIA, of course, a separate federal agency that is in charge of all of this funding for broadband and digital equity, will have to take a version of that FCC map, one of the future iterations of it, and decide how much money each state is going to get based on the formula that they are prescribed to follow in their notice of funding opportunity and in congressional statute. So that's why it's kind of this parallel and Frankenstein almost approach to it, because then after that happens, states can then take that map, take the money they're getting from NTIA, and then build more on top of it to hopefully, if they choose to do so, be even more accurate with their funding decisions. But it's important for us to be looking at this set of data right now to ensure that states will have the appropriate amount of money to then go on and do that that further refining and further improvement. So just want to make that crystal clear. We're at right now at this first point right here of first 2 points in between these two bullets of this bulk fabric challenge process that will have significant ramifications on future things, but it won't be the end of this discussion by any means. So I just want to make sure that we're putting that out as clearly as possible. But yeah, Dustin, I think you're up next to take us in a little further.
Yeah, so thank you all for framing that up. I get the fun job of talking about navigating the FCC portals. And I went ahead and wore my Grace Harbor County Fair shirt because we're all going to have a goat load of fun today. And we'll just start off with what you as community leaders need to do to get the process started to accessing, if you haven't already, working with and ultimately challenging specifically the fabric data, in this case, that base layer of the maps. And so I'm going to try to put this in terms of what to expect and kind of how to, some recommendations or suggestions around how to approach it, and kind of stripping out some of the fluff that you might get in other webinars and really get to a realistic approach of what this is going to take. Might not spend as much time with the specific details in the data specification for the challenge process, because we could spend hours on that and we don't have that today, but certainly would look forward to talking about that in the future. So for anyone, we're just going to start at the beginning. If some of you are already through this, bear with me for a little while, but if you don't have any accounts with the FCC and you're working towards getting access to that fabric, you start by registering a user account in the Commission Registration System, or CORS. You just have to input the standard account information that you would expect, verify your email. If you don't see it, probably check the spam. I know that has been a hang up in a couple of processes that we're trying to figure out what was going on. So throughout this process, just check the spam when you're expecting an email. And then once you've set up that account, verified your email, you'll have access to then go log into the CORS system. And in many cases, if you're working with a local or state government or a tribal government, there may already be existing federal registration numbers or FRNs in place that somebody signed up for previously. It's always good to check and see what's already in place, figure out who signed up for that and why they signed up for it, to see if it makes sense to use that same FRN. So ask around, and also you can search publicly the FRN records to see if there is one associated with your entity. It's best when you're searching if you can use like an employer identification number or something like that, because the name has to match exactly. So we signed up with the Marconi Society. If I don't put the comma and Inc. on it, it won't show up. So just keep that in mind. And if you are able to find one that's in existence, it'll have the listed contact that's associated with that, and it'll have if you're in a large enough organization that you don't know who that person is, it will also have their contact information. And if they're no longer there, that's a separate process. And then if you find that none exists, you can just go ahead and register a new one. And if you are registering a new FRN, and this slide's of course focused on those that are signing up as a governmental entity, be sure in this process that you select the right governmental type, because that will need to match and sync up with your separate account that we'll talk about in a second. So once you've signed up and you have that FRN in hand, now you get to go to a separate portal. It's the bdc.fcc.gov. That stands for BDC is Broadband Data Collection. You'll log in using the same login information that you use for the CORS portal. And when you log in, it should just pop up. You should see something like this screenshot here, which will provide a list of all of the FRNs associated with the entity. Like I said, some entities may have multiple of them. But you want to figure out which one you'll be using to access the fabric and to potentially challenge it. And as I mentioned earlier, once you go in and you have your new FRN or your old one, you'll need to register in the kind of add some data around the entity type of the FRN associated within this BDC portal. And so you're going to want to make that, like, it gets a little complicated because they change up the structure a little bit. So it's not an exactly one-to-one in terms of the entity type and subtype that you'll find when you're signing up for the FRN, but it's close enough that you should intuitively be able to figure it out. Just sign up as government and then the relevant type of government. This is a process that I've seen some entities get hung up on. Further down in that page, this is all part of the same page within the BDC portal. There are two boxes to check. One around bulk crowdsourced challenge data. That one's the one that I have checked here. And then there is the broadband availability data. That is the data that the ISPs submit onto the fabric through the portal that will get the Jake was referencing earlier, that will be made available in shortly here in November, we hope. And governmental entities can submit that data. However, it is required that they go through a few extra steps, including having a signed certification that the entity doing so is the primary entity for broadband mapping in that location, and that they are qualified to file this type of data, and that letter needs to come from the jurisdictional executive. So if it's at the state level, the governor, mayor, county executive, etc. So unless you can always go back and check it later if you decide that you want to take this step, but given that the goal at this point in the game is really to get you through the process quickly, we want to suggest that you leave that box unchecked unless you already have that letter of approval in hand. Although it is worth noting that if you are really interested in providing that broadband availability data and you think you have the data ready to submit, you'd want to get that process moving pretty soon as well. So bear with me, we're not quite there yet. We don't have access to the fabric just yet. There is a review process. So once you've submitted that entity information in the BDC portal, FCC staff will review it if it's approved, then the contact information will be forwarded on to CostQuest. CostQuest is the vendor that was selected to develop the fabric, and CostQuest retains the proprietary ownership over that fabric as well, which is why they are a link in this chain, and a part of why there are so many hoops to jump through. So once that contact information is forwarded onto CostQuest, then we're kind of transitioning into working with CostQuest. So from that point, you can expect, hopefully within 3 to 5 business days, you'll receive an email from CostQuest. This is another place in which I've seen some communities get caught up. I actually didn't go through this in the earlier stages, but when you're signing up for the entity information in the BDC portal, there are 2 contacts that you have to list: the data contact official and the certifying official. The emails will go to the certifying official, not the data contact official. So and those emails also, again, check your spam. Have seen that become an issue where the person doing the work as the data contact official to go through the portal was expecting the email to come to them, and the certifying official didn't see it because it ended up in the spam and it hadn't been flagged that they should necessarily, that they would be the ones to receive it. So just want to put that out there as you're navigating this process. That's another thing to keep an eye out for. Once you do get that email, you'll be invited to create a CostQuest account. And then once you have that account, if the person engaging with that is authorized to be a signatory to a license agreement, then they can just go ahead and do so. But if not, really they're preparing the people that will need to be signing these things ahead of time is a good idea, because each step in this process adds a few days. And when we're talking about a challenge process that ultimately should be submitted within a few weeks, having the conversations in parallel to going through this process will be important for efficiently getting through it, that being a relative term. So we look at what needs to happen to get that license agreement signed. If the person that signed up for the CostQuest account is not authorized to sign, then you have to add an additional licensee that is authorized to sign. That adds a 1 to 2 day process into the fold. This is something to communicate upfront as well. As I mentioned, CostQuest is a private company, and so the license agreement that the authorized signatory will be entering into is with a private company with non-negotiable terms. So it would be good to have those conversations up front so that the authorized signatory is aware and has a chance to review and understand why they are signing a license agreement with a private company and not with the FCC. And so I just want to continue to emphasize just the communication in this process. Once these things are in place, you can submit a license request to CostQuest. That process to request, or that they process those requests in about 1 to 2 days. You sign an agreement. Once that's signed within 1 to 3 days, you'll receive a completed agreement. And then shortly after that, you'll receive a link to access the fabric data. So we're finally there. We have access to the fabric data. Now you get to figure out how to work with the data and what to do with it. The ways in which the fabric data can be used are ultimately pretty limited. They can be used to file basically those 2 boxes that I showed you earlier. They can be used to file broadband availability data, or they can be used to file challenges. So we're really talking about the use case of filing challenges here. There are 7 types of challenges that can be filed. Some of them impact the total number of broadband serviceable locations, and others are related to an inaccurate location or the number of units within a structure, or an incorrect primary or supplemental address. And this is so important because the number of, as was explained earlier, the number of broadband serviceable locations, and especially those that are unserved, will ultimately impact the amount of funding that goes to each state and how much money is available to serve those throughout that state in the sub-grantee process. And so given the short timelines, the complexity of the process, I would recommend that in this process, you really focus in on the types of challenges that have the opportunity to change that number of broadband serviceable locations. We want this data set to ultimately be as good as it can be moving forward, but also recognize there are limited timelines, limited resources, and a lot of places where you all need to be focusing those resources and that energy. And so the ones highlighted in green are kind of the two that I would recommend focusing the majority of your effort on, and that's missing broadband serviceable locations and incorrect location building type codes. I think missing broadband serviceable location is kind of described well in that type of challenge. Somewhere that should have access to broadband or can receive broadband services just is missing entirely from the data set. For incorrect location building type code, there are a variety of different classifications of building type in this data set. Those are residential, business, enterprise, community anchor institution. I don't think I can rattle just all of them off the top of my head, but the two that count as broadband serviceable locations are the business and residence. And so the reason why this one is so important is because if something is incorrectly classified or presumed to not be a customer of what they call mass market broadband services, so like the general retail services that you would buy from kind of the general incumbent ISPs that we usually think of, or from your municipal network. One example of that would be community anchor institutions. So within this fabric, it is presumed that any community anchor institution receives enterprise level service, which is often not the case, especially as we look out to more rural communities that may not have that enterprise connection available to them. And so that's an example in which you would want to reclassify that in a way that correctly identifies it as a broadband serviceable location. And sometimes it might just be that somebody's house was identified as a barn or something like that. So a variety of ways to look at that. And just wanted to kind of show you a lot of this data is ultimately operating out of CSVs and spreadsheets. So the challenge format that we have here is just basically plugging in your contact information, the category code. These correspond to these 7 challenge types right here. Location ID is only applicable if the location is actually portrayed in the fabric itself, because that's the proprietary location ID that's provided by CostQuest, and then you include some of the address information, and over here in the L column, that's the building type that was referencing with respect to whether something is correctly classified as a business or a residence or an otherwise broadband serviceable location. And so once you have all this, you're kind of ready to go. You figured out what types of challenges, how the process works. You're going to get the Fabric data. You can download it as a CSV. Putting it into a GIS system is ultimately, a GIS process is ultimately the recommended way to work with this, especially as we're thinking about trying to identify what locations are missing. Trying to work with just the coordinates and figure out outside of that what's missing and what's not could be a cumbersome process. And as was referenced earlier, local communities have a lot of data and knowledge that CostQuest and the FCC don't have, and that may lead to inaccurate results. And so just somewhat of a strategic approach, given the limited timeline that we have to get these challenges in place prior to the version of the maps that will be used for the BEAD allocation. Is to just start with the raw numbers. Look at the number of locations that you would have expected to be included in your area, and then look at the number of total broadband serviceable locations that are in the Fabric. And if you notice a discrepancy, you can kind of narrow in on different areas and figure out where some of those discrepancies are the most pronounced. And then you can really target in where you're focusing based on those tightened in locations, rather than feeling like in 3 weeks you have to gather all of the data on all of the locations in your entire community. You may want to think about that in the long term, but given the short timelines, focusing in on those areas of discrepancies is really one way to go about efficiently going through this process. And then once you've identified those and you've gathered the data, it's just preparing it and pulling it together as the challenge in the challenge format that we just saw, as well as an evidence document to identify all of the different ways in which you can challenge. Jake?
Yeah, sorry, Dustin, not to interrupt your flow, but just on that point, there's a few questions about multifamily units and different types of structures and how those may be counted and what people should be thinking about in terms of prioritization. So I wanted to just tee you up to mention a little bit on that.
Yeah. Thanks for flagging that. That one's a little bit of a complicated one. Some less so, some more so.
That's why I'm having you answer it.
Thank you. No, but so as we think about like multiple dwelling units or multiple tenant environments, the Fabric map includes a unit count for each structure. So to the best of their knowledge, they'll identify how many units are within that structure. However, regardless of the number of units included in that structure, for the purposes of these maps, that's treated as one broadband serviceable location. So, so a multiple dwelling unit with 50 units counts the same as a single family home for the purposes of broadband, the total number of broadband serviceable locations, and if they're unserved, the number of unserved broadband serviceable locations. It gets a little bit more complicated as we talk about duplexes, townhomes, parcels with multiple structures on them. If they're distinct structures with either unique ownership or unique residence, then those are generally considered, if they're standalone structures, generally considered to be each their own broadband serviceable location, even if they're on the same parcel. I have to admit, I'm a little bit fuzzy on how they figure out the difference between like a townhome and a duplex. If they're on separate parcels, I think they're considered separate broadband serviceable locations, but if there's not a property line in between them, like if I guess like row homes in DC might be an example. Each of those might be considered a broadband serviceable location because there's a parcel line and ownership over those. But if there was just a similar setup in out here in Washington State, where it's just like a quadplex, 4 connected homes all on the same parcel that are kind of sold out as units, that might be considered one broadband serviceable location. That's where I start to get a little fuzzy, and I think it gets to be a little bit more complicated. I was watching some of the FCC webinars, and they're like, well, and if it's a townhouse, maybe it counts. If it's a duplex, I don't know what the difference between townhomes and duplexes are, but you know, there's some nuance in there that's worth diving into. But generally speaking, if there is a single structure with multi-family units on it that are on a single parcel, that would be considered one broadband serviceable location. And if they are separate structures with separate permanent residents, generally they will be considered separate. Although it is important to flag here that in those cases where there are multiple structures on one parcel, that the default is to classify them as one broadband serviceable location, because they assume that there's one residence, and that others might be sheds, barns, things like that. And unless CostQuest felt that they had strong enough data to prove that there were 2, the default is to treat those as one. The exception to that, again, it's kind of a convoluted answer, but is mobile homes or manufactured homes, because they felt that they had the algorithm down to identify those with more reliable results.
Thanks for that, Dustin. And sorry to open the can of worms, but I feel like it was useful to peek into the can of worms, then close it quickly again.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for flagging that question. And feel free to jump in if there are any others. We'll jump into just the process of this. The last step in this part of the presentation is what it's like to actually file the challenge in the portal. So back to the FCC portals. In this process, should you choose to proceed and work with this data and file a challenge, you're going to find yourself spending a lot of time with FCC documents, FCC webinars. Personally, I've watched those. I've seen how the data is presented. It's presented in a way that presumes that they are right, and that you have to meet a pretty high bar to prove their algorithms wrong. And they really present it in a way that seems so confident that they focus more on these elements of the challenge, if we go back to these challenge types, that aren't actually going to move the needle on the number of locations, which is ultimately what impacts how much money comes to your state and how much money is available for the communities throughout your state. And in this process also, I have to say, both in the webinars and in the interactions that I have seen, there is a tendency to try to make the people planning and filing the challenges feel inadequate, and like the data that you have is not as valuable as theirs. And I would encourage you to not let that discouragement get in the way of going through this process, because we need the local data. You know your community best. Focus on these areas that are going to move the needle, and be confident in the data that you have, because it's the valuable data that we need. And don't let that discouragement get in your way. You have supporters in us and and outside of this group as well. And always happy to jump in and support that. Just quickly running through what it's like to file a challenge. You have all of your data compiled, you've identified the areas where there are errors, and you have compiled that into your spreadsheet and you're ready to submit. So you go back to bdc.fcc.gov, click on the FRN of the entity filing the challenge. And that was supposed to be a different screenshot, but more or less the same thing. Just imagine down here, there's your FRN number, and it says next to that entity name. And then you'll go to the next submissions dashboard, and under crowdsourced challenge submissions, click bulk fabric challenge. You'll go into this. I signed up on the Marconi Society. I don't actually have access to the fabric, so couldn't really pull together a real one, but they have some sample data that could be used to kind of figure out the process. So you come in, you upload your CSV that you filled out, and it'll run a process. It'll tell you, it'll spit out errors. Like the first time I filed it, I didn't put dashes in my phone number, and so it'll spit out an error. Gotta re-upload it and fix that. And then you get to, oh, and then you have to upload your evidence as well, whether that's like public utility records demonstrating residential service, or tax data, assessor data, things like that. And then you have an opportunity to look at the location that you're challenging. It'll show up as a little dot here. You click on that, it'll show all of the different fields of your challenge. This is my house, really exciting, a lot of detail on that map. And if everything looks good to you, then you go on and you certify your challenge, say that, you know, attest to everything being true. I did not take this step, so I just left it blank. This is not a real challenge, but if you were to go through this, you know, just put in the contact information, certify it, and then you've basically submitted it. So, and then after that, there will be a review process, and you'll find out whether your data was ultimately accepted for those, and whether your challenges were successful or not.
Dustin, thank you
That's about all I got.
so much for walking through that. It's, I think, immensely helpful. Like Dustin said, there are other resources from the FCC that walk through this in painstaking detail at times, but hopefully this crash course in it is useful for anyone that's going through this process right now or thinking about it, because there is, like we've been stressing, there is a level of urgency in getting this challenge on the fabric in as soon as possible, because it will be used for the next availability reporting that's opening soon. So if we want to jump to the next slide, and Corian, if I can pass it over to you to talk a little bit about what folks should be doing right now, in addition to taking copious notes on everything Dustin says.
Yeah, definitely. Everyone is super lucky to have Dustin here to walk us through all of this, because I already understand the process a lot better than I did before. So I appreciate you taking the time to walk us through that. So if you haven't already accessed the FCC's portal, now you have all of the tools to be able to do that. The most important date that's coming up is like next week. If you can, as quickly as possible, submit your bulk location fabric challenges, because there's no specific cutoff for that. But the sooner you can get them in, the more likely that they'll be included, like Jake was saying, in the allocation process at NTIA. So make sure you do that as quickly as possible. And also getting in touch with your state broadband officer. I know we talked about this earlier, but see how you can get involved in the state FCC challenge process, because some of these data sources can be aggregated at the state level. And then you have a little extra backing if you're a a local government and you send it to your state, there's a little bit more reinforcement if there's two local and state entities working together to submit to the FCC. And also, just to reiterate that this whole process at the FCC is very important. It's highly technical and there's a lot of information here, but it's not the whole puzzle, and it's not the be all end all. And there are going to, in the future, be opportunities to improve it. So in the Broadband Data Act that is requiring the FCC to set all of this up, there's a required level of oversight from the Government Accountability Office. So to the extent that you can at the local level, be documenting everything that you're doing. There are a few constraints with the COSQuest license that limit what you can do, what you can put out publicly, but internally, like, be documenting everything that you're doing, document what your residents are saying, because all of that, even if it can't be used in the FCC's process, we can use it at NCC. We're happy to help you set up the stage so that you can use that for broader advocacy, so that we can all have broadband maps that reflect what our communities are saying. And state elected officials, federal elected officials, they're all interested in this information. We all are working together to make sure that we have accurate information on the maps. So this is a common goal, and making sure that we have really good documentation is really the key to making these processes better over time. And I think that is it from me, but I know Jake probably has a bit more to say on the state side of things there.
Yeah, I'll just plug a few more things. That's really helpful, Corey. And I think, as demonstrated by 150 people being on this call on a Friday afternoon, there's a lot of interest in this topic. There's a lot of questions still outstanding, even though the ball is rolling down the hill kind of very quickly at this point. But I would encourage you all to if you are a local government official, I know every state broadband office in the country is thinking about this issue and how it will affect their program. So we have a link in the slide deck. So once we share it around, there's the NTIA has contact information. So if you do not know your state broadband office, you can search for it on NTIA's site under the State Broadband Leaders Network page. And then for the states that are on the line, encourage you all to be thinking about your local elected officials as the boots on the ground for you, because we've heard from many of you that you're already talking to, your county, you're hearing from your county officials, hearing from your mayors, because they have the data at their fingertips as well as to where their communities are. So the level of what you can empower them to show, to be a verifier for what you are submitting at the state level, as well as an aggregator. So if you would like to create some funneling method for being able to submit one large bulk challenge, that you'd be able to have the structure in place in order to do that. The other thing to flag for states is that this is this is an extremely critical window to hit, and with this challenge window is really critical to hit. There will be this other public challenge period that's going to be coming out once the broadband availability map is live, where individuals will be able to click on the FCC's map and report both on the location side and on the availability side. And we can provide some more resources, because even that process has its own complications and outstanding questions for. But I think those would be two really critical periods of time for state broadband offices to be connecting with their local officials and being as clear and upfront about why this matters and what can be done about it. I'll also just plug in, we don't have other federal agencies on here, but we did get a question about other federal agencies outside of NTIA and FCC using this data. I would encourage, if anyone from a different agency is on the line, they have not, and they're interested in this and they have not already talked to the FCC about it, would encourage you to do so. Your agency may be covered under the MOU that was signed previously, or there may be some process for you to follow. But even if you are, I think it's, Dustin, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think any local, state, federal agency has the ability to access the Fabric data from CostQuest through their process, even if they are not planning to submit a challenge. I don't think you are required to submit a challenge if you go through the process of accessing the data. So there was a question on that. Just wanted to clear that up. Okay, so with that, we have, 5 minutes left. Great. Let's jump to some of the questions we've gotten in already, and we've been trying to respond to as many live as possible. We have another 20 in the queue, but Dustin, if you want to just go to the next slide, we have a few that we pulled out that we wanted to be sure to hit on that we got ahead of time. So the state maps and how they will factor into the FCC's mapping process. I'll take a swing at this one. It depends on how they will factor in and if they will factor into the FCC's mapping process and how they may factor into the eventual allocation or the eventual awarding of projects that will happen maybe sometime next year or years after, the money comes out from NTIA. And I say it depends partially because many states, the maps that they've collected may have defaulted to, they may have relied on formula or the form 477 and relied on census block areas. This, of course, this new version of the map is individual location based. So there's no way to immediately make those gel together. And then the other common state broadband map that has been created prior to this process has been reliant on speed tests. And as I think Dustin flagged, maybe we haven't really talked about it, but the availability challenge process does not treat speed tests with the same level of validity as other components of the challenge. So it's the state broadband maps will still be very important, but for this instance, it will very much vary in terms of how easy it is to apply them to the FCC's process. Everybody else on our speaking panel, is that a fair characterization for number one, more or less? Okay, two more that we pulled out here. Are consultants able to view the map on behalf of a public sector clients? Anybody want to take a swing at this one?
Jake, I answered it in the actual question answering or question Q&A box or whatnot as well. But yes, consultants and third parties are allowed to get access to the fabric and the BDC system on behalf of the entity that they're going to be working for. That entity does have to associate you in CORS, as Dustin mentioned earlier, and with their FCC registration number. And after that process is complete, they can submit data in the BDC system as an authorized user. But that is also, I want to make sure I wrote that out also for folks that may be driving or something like that or on the road. It will all be captured later for you to understand it. But yes, consultants can and third parties, especially for rural communities that are going to be partnering with folks like that to do some of this work. So yes.
Thank you, Anderson. And then number three, I think we've touched on this a little bit, but the level of evidence, I think Dustin has kind of outlined this a little bit well in terms of the data specifications, but of proving a location is there. I'm not sure if Dustin or Corey, if you have any thoughts on number three, both on the location side, and then maybe we'll, as much as you want to talk about the service availability challenge side.
Sure. I'm happy to jump in just with a quick answer, which is that it depends, which is like every local government is a little bit different in the data that they have, but any information that you have at the local level on infrastructure is probably going to be at least in some way insightful into this process. So some local governments have trash service, different emergency services, different utility services, all of that stuff could be really helpful for figuring out whether the map matches what you're seeing on the ground in your community. So I would say I'm happy to talk more one-on-one about what might be available to you, but I think that it really depends on what services the local government is offering and also how granular they are as to whether they'll meet the FCC's evidentiary standard. But I think a good starting place is just to coordinate internally with local government agencies that are doing different types of projects that have local infrastructure impact. and seeing how they compare to the broadband data.
Okay, I'm just going to pull out a few things from chat as we're wrapping up. One, a tip from Adam on the submission side. If you are saving in a CSV in Excel and you get errors on your first submittal, make sure your blank cells don't have a space in them for everyone's information. I think that's a great tip. I'm going to go ahead and put that in the Q&A box if anybody missed it. And then ask my other speakers if they've seen any other Q&As that they would like to elevate right now before we close things up and take these questions offline and start filling them in our some after hours resources. Anderson, you're on mute if you were trying to say something.
And Dustin might have already answered this, but I definitely want to bring it back to the in rural areas, farmers and workshops have grain storage facilities that need connectivity to improve efficiency and productivity. Will those facilities be able to be considered serviceable? And maybe how? Maybe reiterating that question, because we've had a couple of them that relate to on the farming side of things. So maybe just reiterating that answer would be good. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, we will definitely do that in our resources. So with that, we are at our time. I want to thank you all so much for joining us here today. We have a ton of questions that we have not been able to get to. As Anderson just mentioned, we will be sending out some more answers to them elsewhere. And this recording will be posted on right here, the National Broadband Resource Hub at broadbandhub.org, along with other resources on this topic. So with that, thank you to my fellow speakers for joining us here today. And thank you all for signing on with us. Hope everybody has a great weekend.